When I first moved into my house on Pine Ridge Lane, I thought I'd found the perfect place. It wasn't too big or too small, just right for me and Max, my golden retriever. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with tree-lined streets and friendly faces waving hello as they passed by in their cars. Everything about it felt like a fresh start after years of living in the noisy city. But what I didn't know then was that this quiet little corner of the world came with rules, lots of them, and people who were more than willing to enforce them. From the moment I unpacked my first box, the Homeowners Association, or HOA, made sure I knew they existed. Flyers appeared on my front door before I'd even finished setting up furniture inside. Reminder: grass must be mowed weekly, one said. Another warned me not to leave trash cans out past collection day. At first, I brushed it off. Sure, these notices were annoying, but how bad could it really be? I figured if I kept things tidy and followed basic courtesy, I'd have no problems. But here's the thing. I wasn't actually part of the HOA. When I bought the house, no one told me I had to join. My real estate agent hadn't mentioned it during our meetings, and nothing in the paperwork said membership was mandatory. So when those flyers started showing up, I assumed they were suggestions, not commands. Boy, was I wrong. One morning, just 2 weeks after moving in, there was a sharp knock at my door. It was early, not quite sunrise, and I stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed, wondering who could possibly be visiting so soon. When I opened the door, I saw 4 men standing there, all wearing matching uniforms with the HOA logo stitched onto their jackets. They looked official, almost intimidating. One of them stepped forward, holding a clipboard like it was some kind of badge of authority. "Good morning, sir," he said in a tone that was anything but friendly. "We're here regarding several violations reported on your property." "Violations?" I repeated, still half asleep. "What are you talking about?" He glanced down at his clipboard and began listing offenses. Overgrown grass, which wasn't true. I'd cut it just days ago. Improper placement of outdoor decorations. I didn't have any. And unauthorized modifications to the landscaping. A few potted plants near the porch. Each accusation sounded crazier than the last. "I'm not part of your HOA," I told him firmly, crossing my arms. "These rules don't apply to me." The man smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Whether you're officially a member or not, your actions affect the entire community. You will comply, or we'll take action." Before I could argue further, he signaled to the others, and they pushed past me without waiting for permission. They marched into my house as though they owned the place, rifling through drawers and inspecting every corner. Outside, more members of their crew arrived, armed with tools and equipment. Chainsaws roared to life, cutting down bushes and tearing apart the wooden fence I'd built myself. The shed where I kept gardening supplies was smashed to pieces. My once cozy yard quickly turned into a disaster zone. Max barked wildly, trying to protect us, but one of them grabbed him and locked him in the bathroom. I shouted and tried to stop them, but it was useless. By the time they left hours later, my home looked like it had been hit by a storm. Broken glass covered the floors, furniture lay overturned, and the backyard was completely destroyed. And worst of all, no one seemed to care. The morning after the raid, I woke up to a scene that felt surreal. Sunlight streamed through the broken window pane, casting long shadows over the mess they'd left behind. Shards of glass sparkled on the floor like cruel confetti, and the air smelled faintly of sawdust from the demolished fence outside. My hands trembled as I walked through the house, taking in the damage. Drawers had been emptied, their contents scattered across the floor. Books lay strewn about, pages bent and torn. Even my favorite chair, a worn but cozy piece I'd inherited from my grandmother, had been slashed open, its stuffing spilling out onto the carpet. Max whimpered softly from the bathroom where they'd locked him up. When I finally opened the door, he bolted out, tail tucked between his legs. He sniffed at the destruction nervously before curling up in a corner, clearly shaken. Seeing him like that broke something inside me. This wasn't just an attack on my property. It was an invasion of our home, our sanctuary. And for what? Overgrown grass? A few potted plants. It didn't make sense. I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, trying to process everything. Who did these people think they were? How could they justify barging into someone's house, destroying their belongings, and acting like it was perfectly okay? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But anger alone wouldn't fix this. I needed answers and justice. That afternoon, I called the police. Surely, this kind of behavior couldn't be legal. An officer arrived within the hour, looking sympathetic but hesitant. As I led him through the wreckage, explaining what had happened, he nodded along quietly. But when I finished, his expression turned grim. "It sounds like a civil matter," he said carefully. "You'll need to take this up with the HOA directly." A civil matter. I repeated, incredulous. They broke into my house. They destroyed my things. Doesn't that count as trespassing? Vandalism? He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Technically, yes. But because they claim it's related to HOA rules, it complicates things. You might want to consult a lawyer. Consult a lawyer. Those words echoed in my mind long after the officer left. I stared out the window at the ruins of my yard, the mangled remains of my flower beds, the splintered wood where my fence used to stand. Was this really happening? Could a group of neighbors actually get away with something like this? Determined not to give up, I started researching online. Late into the night, I scoured forums and articles about HOAs, reading stories from other homeowners who had faced similar situations. Some talked about fines spiraling out of control until they lost their homes. Others described harassment campaigns designed to drive them out. Each story made me angrier and more resolved to fight back. The next day, I visited a local attorney recommended by a friend. Her name was Lisa, and she specialized in property disputes. She listened intently as I recounted the events, nodding occasionally while jotting notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about your yard or your house," she said finally. "This is about power, about control. If we can prove their actions were unwarranted and excessive, we might have a strong case." Her words gave me hope, but also clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about setting a precedent. If I let them win, who would stop them from doing the same thing to someone else? Someone less able to fight back. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Lisa to build my case. We gathered evidence, photos of the damage, receipts for repairs, copies of the HOA's letters and notices. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering condolences or sharing their own grievances. Most were too afraid to speak publicly, but their support meant more than they realized. Slowly, painfully, I began piecing my life back together, not just physically, but emotionally. One evening, as I swept up shards of glass from the living room floor, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But beneath the weariness, there was something else. Determination. No matter how hard this fight got, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them win. Filing the lawsuit felt like stepping into uncharted territory. I'd never been involved in anything legal before, and the process was overwhelming. Every document we submitted seemed to require another form, another fee, another signature. Lisa, my lawyer, did her best to guide me through it all, but there were moments when doubt crept in. Was I doing the right thing? Could one person really stand up to an entire organization that had so much power? The HOA didn't waste any time responding. Within days of filing the lawsuit, I received a thick envelope filled with paperwork from their lawyers. It was intimidating. Pages upon pages of dense legal jargon designed to confuse and discourage me. They argued that their actions were justified because my violations posed a risk to property values in the neighborhood. Property values. As if anyone cared about the color of my front door or the height of my hedges when deciding whether to buy a house. What struck me most, though, was how impersonal it all felt. The documents referred to me not as a person but as the defendant, as if I were some faceless entity rather than someone whose life had been turned upside down. There was no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, no apology for the destruction they'd left behind. It was cold, calculated, and infuriating. As the weeks dragged on, the stress began to take its toll. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now avoided making eye contact. Some whispered behind closed doors, while others crossed the street to steer clear of me altogether. It wasn't hard to guess why. They were scared of retaliation, scared of becoming the next target. And honestly, I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I might have doubted my own story too. But then something unexpected happened. One evening, as I was sorting through more evidence for the case, there was a knock at the door. Standing on my porch was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She carried a casserole dish wrapped in foil and wore an apologetic smile. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "I'm so sorry. This isn't right." Her words caught me off guard. For weeks, I felt isolated, like I was fighting this battle alone. But here was someone reaching out, offering kindness when I needed it most. We talked for a while, and she told me about her own run-ins with the HOA, how they'd fined her repeatedly for having wind chimes on her porch, claiming they were noise pollution. Eventually, she gave in and took them down, but she regretted letting fear silence her. Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, other neighbors began stopping by. Not many, but enough to remind me that I wasn't entirely alone. Mr. Patel across the street brought over fresh vegetables from his garden. A young couple down the block offered to help clean up the yard. Even Greg Sanders, one of the HOA board members, lingered awkwardly near my mailbox one morning. "Look, I know you probably hate us," he said, shuffling his feet. "And you have every reason to. But not everyone agrees with what happened." His words were hesitant, unsure, but they gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe the HOA's grip on the neighborhood wasn't as ironclad as it seemed. Maybe people were starting to question whether their rules and their methods were worth the cost. Despite these small victories, the road ahead remained daunting. The HOA doubled down, hiring a high-profile attorney known for winning cases like this. Their team filed motion after motion, trying to delay the trial and wear me down. At times, it felt like I was David facing Goliath, except Goliath had unlimited resources and a team of lawyers ready to crush me. Still, I refused to back down. Each setback only fueled my determination. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Max slept soundly beside me, I'd sit at the kitchen table reviewing documents and preparing for court. Lisa assured me we had a strong case, but I knew the real challenge would be proving that the HOA's actions went beyond enforcing rules. They were an abuse of power. One night, as I flipped through photos of the damage again, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about getting justice for myself. It was about sending a message. No one should have to live in fear of losing their home or their dignity because of arbitrary rules enforced without compassion. Whatever happened next, I vowed to keep pushing forward. For me, for Max, and for everyone else who deserved better. Just when I thought the case couldn't get any more complicated, something happened that changed everything. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at my kitchen table going over documents with Lisa when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened it cautiously. Standing on the porch, drenched from the rain, was Greg Sanders. He looked nervous, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Greg was one of the HOA board members, someone who had been part of the group that sanctioned the raid on my property. But something about the way he looked, guilty, almost desperate, made me step aside and let him in. He sat down at the kitchen table, dripping water onto the floor, and pulled out a thick folder stuffed with papers. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he began, avoiding eye contact. and I can't live with myself anymore. This isn't right." Lisa and I exchanged glances, unsure of where this was going. Greg took a deep breath and continued. "What they did to you, it wasn't an isolated incident. The HOA has been doing stuff like this for years. They target people who don't fall in line, who question their authority. And most of the time, those people just give up and move away." As he spoke, he slid the folder toward us. Inside were documents, emails, meeting minutes, financial records that painted a horrifying picture of the HOA's inner workings. Secret meetings held late at night, intimidation tactics used to silence dissenting voices, funds meant for community improvements funneled into personal accounts. Worst of all, there was a pattern. Homeowners singled out, fined into submission, or driven out entirely because they refused to conform. Greg explained how Margaret Hargrove, the HOA president, ran the organization like her own private kingdom. She manipulated rules to suit her agenda and punished anyone who dared challenge her. She convinced everyone that strict enforcement was necessary to protect property values. Greg said bitterly, "But really, it's about control, about making sure no one steps out of line." His confession stunned me. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to say, "I told you so." But mostly, I felt sad. Sad for the neighbors who'd been bullied into silence. Sad for Greg, who clearly carried the weight of guilt for staying quiet for so long. And sad for myself, knowing now just how calculated and cruel the attack on my home had been. Lisa immediately recognized the significance of Greg's evidence. "This could be a game changer," she said, flipping through the documents. "It proves intent. It shows a pattern of behavior that goes beyond enforcing rules. It's harassment." For the first time since the lawsuit began, I felt a flicker of optimism. With Greg's testimony and the documents he provided, we finally had a chance to expose the truth, not just about what happened to me, but about the HOA's abuse of power as a whole. Still, I couldn't help but wonder why Greg had decided to come forward now. When I asked him, he sighed heavily. "Because of you," he admitted. "Seeing how hard you fought made me realize I couldn't stay silent anymore. If nothing changes, they'll keep doing this to other people. And I don't want that on my conscience." His words stayed with me long after he left. That night, as I reviewed the new evidence, I thought about the ripple effect of standing up for yourself. One person's courage can inspire others to do the same. Greg's decision to speak out was proof of that. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could win this fight, not just for me, but for everyone who deserved better than to live in fear of their own neighborhood. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with Greg's help, the scales finally felt like they were tipping in our favor. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. It was packed, neighbors curious about the outcome, reporters eager for a story, and members of the HOA sitting stiffly in their seats, trying to look composed but failing to hide their unease. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Lisa, my lawyer, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. My hands trembled slightly, and Max's leash felt heavy in my pocket, a small reminder of why I was here. When the judge entered and called the court to order, the room fell silent. The HOA's attorney, a polished man with an air of arrogance, began by painting me as a troublemaker who refused to follow simple community guidelines. He argued that their actions were justified because my violations disrupted the neighborhood's harmony and lowered property values. To him, this wasn't about fairness or justice. It was about maintaining control, no matter the cost. Then it was our turn. Lisa stood up, calm and confident, and laid out our case piece by piece. She started with Greg's documents, the emails, meeting minutes, and financial records that exposed the HOA's pattern of abuse. She highlighted how they targeted homeowners, manipulated rules, and misused funds meant for community improvements. Each revelation drew murmurs from the crowd, and I could see Margaret Hargrove shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Next came the witnesses, one by one, Neighbors I barely knew took the stand to share their stories. A retired teacher recounted how the HOA fined her repeatedly for planting flowers that didn't match their approved list, eventually forcing her to sell her home. A young couple described being threatened with legal action because their mailbox was painted the wrong shade of blue. Another neighbor talked about how his family's garden gnome collection, a cherished tradition, was confiscated during a surprise inspection. Their voices wavered with emotion, but their determination never faltered. When it was my turn to testify, I walked slowly to the witness stand, my heart pounding. Lisa guided me through my story, asking questions that allowed me to explain everything step by step. I described waking up to strangers invading my home, tearing apart my belongings, and destroying my yard. I showed photos of the damage, the broken windows, the demolished fence, the ruined flower beds. I pointed to scars on my hands where shards of glass had cut me while cleaning up. And when I finished speaking, the room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Margaret took the stand last, her usual confidence wavering under cross-examination. Lisa pressed her on inconsistencies in her statements, pointing out discrepancies between her claims and the evidence we presented. At first, Margaret tried to deflect, insisting that the HOA's actions were always in the best interest of the community. But as Lisa continued questioning her, cracks began to show. Her answers grew defensive, her tone increasingly erratic. By the end, she looked nothing like the authoritative figure she'd once been. As the trial wrapped up, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. Waiting for their decision felt like an eternity. Every tick of the clock echoed in my ears, each second stretching longer than the last. Outside, news vans lined the street, reporters speculating about what might happen next. Inside, I sat silently, replaying every moment of the trial in my mind. Finally, after hours that felt like days, the jury returned. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the verdict. We find in favor of the plaintiff. The room erupted into chaos. Cheers from supporters, gasps from the HOA members, and a flurry of questions from reporters. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. We'd won. Against all odds, we'd won. Lisa squeezed my hand, smiling brightly. You did it, she said simply. But as I looked around the courtroom, I realized this victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had suffered in silence, who had dared to hope for change. And though the scars of what happened would linger for a long time, I knew something important had shifted, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. The verdict sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, shoving microphones in my face and firing questions faster than I could answer. How does it feel to win? One asked. What's next for you? Another pressed. I mumbled a few responses, still overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, anger, vindication. It all collided at once, leaving me dizzy. But as the initial excitement faded, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The judge didn't just rule in my favor. He ordered the HOA to pay substantial damages, not only to me but also to others who had been harmed by their actions. Margaret Hargrove and several key members were banned from holding leadership positions in any homeowners association moving forward. Most importantly, sweeping reforms were mandated to ensure transparency and accountability within the HOA. For weeks after the trial, the neighborhood buzzed with conversations about what had unfolded. Neighbors who had previously avoided me now stopped by to congratulate me or simply thank me for standing up. Some shared their own stories of frustration, admitting they'd been too afraid to speak out until now. Others offered help rebuilding my yard, planting new flowers, and even repairing the fence. Slowly, tentatively, trust began to rebuild. One evening, Greg Sanders showed up at my door again. This time, he wasn't nervous. He looked almost hopeful. I wanted to say thank you, he said earnestly. You made us see what we'd become. His words caught me off guard. Part of me still resented him for being part of the system that had caused so much harm. But another part understood that change doesn't happen overnight, and that people can grow if given the chance. "You're the one who helped turn things around," I told him. "Without your evidence, we wouldn't have won." He nodded, looking relieved. "Still, I owe you an apology for everything. If I'd spoken up sooner, maybe none of this would have happened." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I invited him inside, and we talked for hours about what needed to change, not just in the HOA, but in how we treated each other as neighbors. By the end of the night, I realized something important. Holding onto bitterness wouldn't fix the past. Forgiveness might not erase the pain, but it could pave the way for healing. As word of the trial spread beyond Pine Ridge Lane, local news stations ran exposes on the HOA's abuses of power. Calls poured in from homeowners in other neighborhoods, sharing similar experiences and asking for advice on how to fight back against oppressive associations. For the first time, I felt like our struggle had meaning beyond just my own life. It was inspiring others to stand up for themselves too. Despite the progress, the scars remained. My house still bore reminders of the raid: cracked window panes, scratches on the walls, and patches of uneven grass where the flower beds used to be. Inside, Max flinched whenever someone knocked on the door, his tail tucked between his legs. It broke my heart to see him like that, a constant reminder of the trauma we'd endured. Rebuilding wasn't easy. Every trip to the hardware store, every hour spent hammering nails or planting seeds, came with flashes of memory I wished I could forget. But little by little, the pieces fell into place. The backyard started to look alive again, filled with color and life. Inside, I replaced broken furniture and patched up holes in the walls. Each repair felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a step toward making the house feel like home once more. Through it all, I learned something unexpected. Resilience isn't about never breaking. It's about finding the strength to put yourself back together when you do. And while the road ahead would still have its challenges, I knew I wasn't walking it alone anymore. Neighbors who had once been strangers were now allies, united by a shared desire for fairness and respect. Late one night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars, Max curled up at my feet. I allowed myself a moment of peace. The battle was over, but the journey was far from finished. Still, for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Hopeful that the neighborhood could heal. Hopeful that justice could bring change. And hopeful that, no matter how hard things got, good people willing to stand up for what's right could make a difference. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to transform, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The HOA, once a shadow looming over everyone's lives, started to change under new leadership. People who had previously been too afraid to speak up now attended meetings, voicing their opinions and demanding transparency. Rules were rewritten with input from residents, and enforcement became less about punishment and more about finding solutions that worked for everyone. It wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard, but progress was undeniable. My house slowly regained its charm, thanks in part to the kindness of neighbors who pitched in to help. Mr. Paddle brought over a bag of wildflower seeds, insisting they'd grow beautifully near the fence. Mrs. Thompson spent an entire Saturday afternoon teaching me how to prune rose bushes, her hand steady as she guided mine. Even Greg stopped by occasionally, rolling up his sleeves to assist with repairs or offering advice on landscaping. Their support meant more than I could put into words. It reminded me that even after darkness, light can return. One crisp autumn morning, I decided it was time to hang holiday lights again. Last year's display had been torn down before it ever truly shone, but this year felt different. As I strung white bulbs along the roofline and wrapped them around trees, I couldn't help but smile. Max trotted alongside me, tail wagging furiously, clearly thrilled by the activity. When I flipped the switch and saw the warm glow illuminate the yard, something inside me clicked into place. This wasn't just about decorating. It was about reclaiming joy, the kind that comes from standing firm in the face of adversity and refusing to let fear dim your spirit. The first night the lights went up, A few neighbors wandered over, drawn by the soft twinkle. They carried mugs of hot cocoa and plates of cookies, ready to share stories and laughter. Someone brought a portable speaker, filling the air with cheerful music. Before long, what had started as a quiet evening turned into an impromptu gathering. Laughter echoed through the streets, children ran around playing tag, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt alive, not with tension, but with connection. Margaret Hargrove moved away shortly after the trial, citing personal reasons. No one asked questions, and no one seemed particularly upset about her departure. In her place, a quieter, more compassionate woman named Susan took over as HOA president. She made it her mission to rebuild trust, hosting open forums where residents could voice concerns without fear of judgment. Slowly, painfully, the community began to heal. Looking back, I realized that winning the lawsuit hadn't just changed my life. It had changed the neighborhood's trajectory. People who had once tiptoed around rules out of fear now approached issues with confidence and collaboration. Neighbors who barely knew each other's names became friends, bonding over shared struggles and victories. And while the scars of the past would always linger, they served as reminders of resilience rather than defeat. On Christmas Eve, as I stood on the porch watching the lights dance in the frosty air, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the outcome of the trial, but for the lessons it taught me. About courage, about community, about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Max rested his head against my leg, his breathing calm and content. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of a new day, I whispered a silent promise. To myself, to Max, and to the neighborhood. We'd come so far, and I wouldn't let anything take that away. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. Because sometimes, hope doesn't come from grand gestures or dramatic victories. Sometimes, it comes from something as simple as a string of lights, glowing softly in the dark, reminding us that even in the toughest times, there's still beauty worth fighting for. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.